A single cup. And a killer exposed. Welcome to Wired Script Den. I am your host, Denora. This community amazes me. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments make this journey special. Now the mystery begins. It takes a special kind of nerve to show up at Nero Wolfe's brownstone at 10:27 on a Tuesday and start rearranging our atmosphere with perfume and panic. We don't usually book that hour for social experiments. From 9 to 11, Wolfe is upstairs with the orchids, and whatever isn't orchid-related is a sacrilege. I've seen him break off a conversation with a district attorney mid-accusation because a Miltonia needed misting. That was years ago, and the DA still blots when he thinks of it. So when the doorbell pealed, I let it peel. If you play a wrong note in this house, I don't guarantee applause. Fritz popped his head out of the kitchen and gave me the kind of look a Swiss chef reserves for scorched cream. "Archie," he said, "please." We were in a delicate phase with the veal stock. I went to the door intending to preserve civilization by sending whoever it was back to it. I opened up and got a faceful of rain smell, and a woman who had no business looking as if the weather couldn't touch her. She was wrapped in a coat that probably had a French consonant in it somewhere that didn't earn its keep, and her gloves were the color that catalogues call sable and men call brown. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, like we had been introduced yesterday and she'd been charming about it. "That's me," I surrendered, "because it usually is. The man upstairs is with his blooms and I'm with his boundaries. If you've come to sell us magazine subscriptions or salvation, try 1101. She smiled without showing teeth. "I've come to save something particular, and I think you'll let me because this won't keep." She lifted a small hard-sided case from her side, the kind favored by violinists and thieves. It wasn't heavy. The way her wrist angled said the contents had value, not mass. "What is it?" I demanded, but not rudely. "You learn to modulate in a house where silence is the default setting." "A cup," she said. "A very old one. And a very new problem. We don't collect clients by cryptic inventory." Still, something about the way she said cup, like naming a person who wasn't in the room, cut through my better habits. I opened the door wider and stepped back. She came in with grace and a faint clatter. The case's clasp told the hallway it could stop listening now. I hooked her coat and hung it. She took the middle of the red leather chair by the globe, as if it had been waiting, and looked around at the office with the mild curiosity of someone touring a famous stage. The globe, Wolfe's desk angled like a declaration, the wall of books, my own corner where I pretend to be modest about the filing. She made a note of it all just once. The case she put on her knees, hands on it like the lid needed her signature to stay shut. "Your name?" I asked. "Camellia Roke." She watched to see if that landed. It didn't for me. "My father is Oliver Roke," that one did. You can't keep a decent cup of coffee in Manhattan without paying toll to the Roke name. 3 generations of coffee importers with the kind of palate that can make a barista weep. The current heir, Oliver, had expanded from beans to temples, rooms with brass and leather where men who believe in sincerity and single-origin beans go to feel both. "Okay," I said. "And the cup?" "I brought it because I can't explain the problem without it." She looked at the ceiling, toward the orchids and the mountain that tended them. "I also brought it because your Mr. Wolfe might not come down for a person, but he might for this." I grunted. She wasn't wrong. Wolfe had once traveled uptown at an illegal hour to scold a club steward for serving coffee that tasted like memory foam. The steward had quit not long after, for reasons that may have included the company of his conscience. "Give me the short version," I said. "If it's good enough, I'll do something unthinkable and interrupt him. If it's not, I'll do something reasonable and tell you to come back when the sun has moved." "The short version," she said, "is that someone is trying to ruin my father, not by shooting him, by making him lie." I had just enough time to file that under fresh before she flicked the case open. Inside, cradled in foam like a relic that had retired from miracles, was a cup and saucer that were not impressed with me. White porcelain with a translucence that made it seem lit from within, a thin rim banded in gold, and on the side a single spray of blue flowers I didn't know but felt I'd seen in a book next to a woman with a parasol. It had the clean, severe elegance that costs money, and the faint crazing of age around the handle where fingers had told stories. "I am only half a cup expert," I told her. "The half that lifts it to my face. It's Meissen," she said. "Early. A gift to my great-grandfather from a German client he saved from a tariff catastrophe. My father keeps it in his office at the Roke Rooms on 47th. He uses it when he needs to remember who he is. The way some men use a mirror, I agreed. Last week, she said, someone used it to lie. She lifted the cup and, with more reverence than most men give to flags, held it at an angle so I could see inside. The glaze was still luminous. On the bottom, just adjacent to the tiny crossed swords, was a ring. Not of grime, of something rubbed there, thin as a whisper, barely darker than the porcelain. I wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't told me to. Oil, she said, very faint, very deliberate. A particular oil, one our tasters use in training to identify faults. It's an ester blend we use for calibrating the team. A tiny amount would be enough to ghost a flavor through any cup it touched. Sabotage, I translated. In miniature, she nodded. On last Tuesday, Mr. Dorian Chase, a food journalist with an opinion column that can move market share like a lever, came to taste our new single estate roast from Guatemala, which we're debuting next month. He insisted on tasting in my father's office, with my father's service. He has this performative fairness routine. He chooses the cup, the water temperature, the pour to level the playing field. He's a purist, which is to say an egotist with standards. Gently, I suggested. Some of my best friends are egotists. She didn't smile. He chose that cup. My father was annoyed but amused. The tasting went badly. Mr. Chase said the roast was flawed, rotten fruit on the back, a cheap perfume on the nose. He wrote a column that afternoon calling the Roke palate senescent. He used the word senescent. Our investors used stronger words. And then you checked the cup, I said. I checked everything, she said. I don't sleep well and I count, so I counted forks of possibility until the drawer jammed. Then I checked the cup. The ring wasn't there that morning. It's there now. It's faint enough that a dishwasher wouldn't see it. But I have eyes and reason to use them. Who handled the cup between morning and Mr. Chase's aria? My father, me, our steward Ramesh, and Mr. Chase himself. He put his hands on it because he insists on the ritual. He turned the cup in his fingers and made a remark about the old world lending grace to the new. You say someone is using the cup to make your father lie, I said. What was the lie? That he can't tell the difference between a clean roast and a faulted one. That he has lost the tongue that built the house with our name on it. That if he says the coffee is good, he is either deluding himself or deluding the public. She set the cup back like a closing phrase. He told Mr. Chase the cup had been tampered with. Mr. Chase laughed. My father is not a man who can stand being laughed at by a boy who wears a hat at dinner. He threatened to sue. The board called me and said if I couldn't persuade him to apologize, I should persuade him to retire. I would rather slam my hand in the bakery oven. And what brings you here is the belief that if you place the right cup in the right room at the wrong time, Nero Wolfe will notice. She looked at me fully for the first time since she came in. What brings me here is that Mr. Wolfe is famous for two things, not moving and not being wrong. I need both. If he won't see me, he can see the cup. You want him to find the ghost with his mouth, I said. I want him to prove that a taste can be planted, she said. I want him to prove it so the board will keep still. Mr. Chase will write a retraction, and my father will stop looking like a man who has discovered the end of himself at the bottom of a saucer. She spoke without tremor, which in my line is as good as weeping, because it means the weeping has been captured and stored. Fee, I asked, to cover that my ears had already committed treason against the orchids. I'll pay your standard, she said, and if you help me keep my father's name where it belongs, I'll write you a letter of gratitude that will make better men than you blush. I'm not sure that pool has depth, I said. Wait here. Wolfe's rules are clear. He doesn't descend for anything less than a crisis or a meal. But the man's vanity around his palate is an Achilles that wears handmade shoes. The one time I interrupted him at 10:40, I got a learned discourse on the difference between an interloper and a supplicant that lasted longer than some careers. Today I had a gambit. I mounted to the plant rooms and knocked on the first door to remind the orchids they were not the only organisms in the house that desired careful handling. Wolfe was bending over a phalaenopsis, as if it had leaned in to gossip, his massive head like a punctuation mark in butter. He didn't look at me. Archie, a woman's downstairs with a Meissen cup, I said. It has a ring of neurotic esters and a scandal attached. He froze, which is like saying the ocean was damp. But I mean he froze differently. in the way that means his brain went from orchids to appetite without jiggling the needle. "Meissen," he said. "From which period?" "Early," says she, I said. "Blue flowers, crossed swords, gold rim, the price of a small sin." He straightened slowly, as if vacuum was involved. He turned, and the corners of his mouth did something that in him is the equivalent of another man clapping. "Bring the woman to the office. Tell Fritz to warm water to 94 degrees Celsius." He frowned, revised. 92. "And have him prepare a fresh spoon." I smiled at the orchids to show them how a man does his duty and went back down. Camellia Roke was still where I left her, hands on the case, not fiddling. "Good omens, he'll see you," I told her, which is a compliment he pays seldom and mainly to cutlets. "Come along." We staged the room. Fritz arrived with a pitcher, a small kettle, and a spoon that might have had a last bath in Eden. I set the cup on Wolfe's desk, not on the blotter, and Camellia stood, composed herself, and composed again. Wolfe entered like a concept made flesh, which is the only way to explain how a man that wide and that unwilling to walk can make an entrance. He went behind the desk, sat, and looked at Camellia with something that wasn't quite welcome but wasn't quite not. She introduced herself. He nodded once at her name and again at her father's. He looked at the cup and the look sharpened. Men like Wolfe make a ceremony out of changing the focus of their gaze. "You say someone adulterated this instrument," he said. His voice had steel and flannel. "I do," she said briefly. He said she was brief and competent. When she got to the ester blend, he held out a paw for the spoon. Fritz gave it up the way a man surrenders a secret under torture. Wolfe poured a measured amount of the warmed water into the cup, swirled and discarded. He did it again, slower. On the third time he dipped the spoon, shook off the drops with a small motion that would have looked feminine on any other pair of hands, and tasted. He shut his eyes, not out of romance, but to put sight away while taste worked. "Bah," he said, opening them. "Idiot." Camellia flinched. "Which one?" Wolfe's lip curved. "The one who thought this would pass me." He set the spoon down like a judgment and leaned back. "It's clever. The ester blend is the sort the more earnest training programs use to teach tongue to behave. They think they are educating. They are imbuing superstition. The residue here is faint enough to persuade a condition rather than assert a taste. It encourages the taster to label a ghost as a flaw. The trick requires three things: the correct compound, the understanding of the target's ritual, and access to the vessel." He closed his eyes again, not from weariness, but to listen to the argument assembling in his head. "Your father did not detect it, because he tasted the coffee, not the cup. He was thinking of the roast. Mr. Chase detected it because he tasted his column. He was thinking of the theatre. That is the difference between men." Camellia let out something between a breath and a verdict. "You can prove it?" Wolfe opened his eyes and looked satisfied in the way a cat looks satisfied with sunlight. "I can prove that the cup bears the residue, and that the residue is the sort used by conscientious fools. I can prove that its presence is inconsistent with your house's practice, but consistent with a trained taster's toolkit. Whether that constitutes proof that Mr. Chase acted maliciously will depend on who among your circle uses bankruptcy of imagination to pay their bills." She glanced down. Her hands were steady. "There are not many who could have done it." Wolfe nodded. "There are enough, and there is one whose presence in any gathering invites the arithmetic of malice." He lifted a finger at me without moving anything else. "Archie." "Here," I performed. "You will go to the Roke rooms," he said, "and observe as if you were a man susceptible to labels. You will collect the names and habits of all who have handle, or may be tempted to handle the heirloom. You will examine their personal rituals around tasting and their opinions about Mr. Roke's stewardship. Ask questions that would irritate a deity. Meanwhile, I will conduct a small experiment here to determine whether the residue is endemic or recent, and whether our party acted on impulse or practice." "And Mr. Chase?" I inquired. Wolfe's eyes did something like skim the ceiling and return. Journalists with strong palates and weak minds are in fashion. "I will not engage him yet. If I summon him too soon, he will perform. I prefer men to perform only once in my presence." Camelia's mouth did a ghost of a smile. "What do I tell my father?" Wolfe looked at the cup, not at her. "That he is not senescent, that he has been played upon, that he is to refrain from rhetorical gestures that involve courts until I tell him to do something worse." He paused, then added, with the magnanimity of a man who understands the psychology of heirs, and that he should not drink from that cup until I am done with it. She stood. "You'll take the case?" "I have already taken the cup," Wolfe said, "and that commits me to its story. Leave it. Leave also a list of all who witnessed the tasting and all who profit from its consequences. Mr. Goodwin will start with names and end with trouble. I require both." She put a card on the desk with a controlled hand. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe." She turned to me. "And you. You're welcome," I told her. "I bill by the hour or by the eyebrow, whichever is more active." When she had gone, carrying away her coat and leaving behind a line of perfume that bowed to Fritz's veal and moved on, I looked at Wolfe. He was already motionless again, except for the small, inward twitch that means he is playing chess with a man only he can see. "Well," I said, "that's a lively storm you let in. What makes you care?" He half closed his eyes, which in him is the equivalent of a soliloquy. "The audacity," he said, "to use a ritual as a weapon, to persuade a man that his senses have deserted him, and then mock him for believing you. That is not merely mischief. It is a species of murder." "Murder?" I lifted an eyebrow. "We've only lost flavor. We have," he said, "lost face. In some households that is more fatal. Go dress, Archie. If you appear at the Roke Rooms looking like a detective, you will watch people tell the truth. I want you to watch them lie." "Yes, sir," I said. "And if I run into Mr. Chase?" He closed his eyes fully now, granting the orchids, the cup, and me temporary parole. "If Mr. Chase tries to lecture you about fairness," he said, "ask him which hand he prefers to touch his props with. Then watch which hand he hides." "Right," I said, heading for the door. "Shall I tell Fritz to hold lunch?" Wolfe made the deep, barbarous sound he keeps for when civilization suggests fasting. "Lunch," he said, "will be eaten. Justice can wait for proper nourishment. That's one of the rules around here. You don't starve the man's body to feed his brain." But as I took my hat, the cup on his desk caught a rectangle of light and held it like a promise. If a cup can tell a story, I intended to be the man who got the quote. The Roke Rooms were the sort of place that wanted you to know it charged extra for the privilege of existing. Grass trim polished until it could see itself, oak paneling so dark it might have been plotting something, and leather chairs arranged in conversational clusters that suggested the conversations were limited to people with memberships. I strolled in as if I'd lost my way to a less expensive club, tipped my hat to the hostess with a smile I keep for occasions like these, and asked for Mr. Roke's office. The hostess, a brisk young woman with hair that was too carefully casual, looked me over with the quick appraisal of someone trained to gauge wallets and intentions in under 3 seconds. "And you are?" she asked. "A man sent to check the plumbing," I said. When that didn't earn me more than an arched brow, I added, "Archie Goodwin, private secretary to Nero Wolfe. Mr. Roke is expecting me." That landed. The name Nero Wolfe carries weight in certain circles, mostly those where being proved wrong in front of an audience is the second worst thing that can happen. She picked up the phone, murmured something, then directed me down a corridor that was too well lit to hide dust. Oliver Roke's office was 2 rooms deep. The first was a waiting area, with a coffee service that looked like it had been designed by a priest in a generous mood. The second was Roke himself, behind a desk that suggested he was not just importing beans but carving commandments. He was in his 60s, lean-faced, with hair the color of bone china and eyes that did not waste motion. "Goodwin," he said, as if I had been announced in a cathedral. "My daughter tells me Wolfe is interested." "Interested enough," I said, taking the chair opposite his. "He's got your cup in custody. He says it's carrying a faint perfume no cup should carry." His hands tightened on the blotter, but his voice was steady. "So I am not losing my tongue." "That's the idea," I said. "But we need more than reassurance. We need to know who had cause to make you look like you'd misplaced your taste buds. That means I get to ask questions you won't like and meet people you may wish I hadn't." Roke's mouth pressed flat. "You'll want to start with those who were present last Tuesday. Dorian Chase, naturally. Ramesh, our steward, Camellia, myself. Anyone else drift in? A board member wanting to see you humbled?" "Not then." But afterward the board made itself heard, loudly. His eyes flicked toward a file on his desk, a fat folder with tabs marked in colors that suggested accountants had been chewing on it. "They are nervous about the Guatemala line. They think my judgment compromised. They whisper retirement like it's salvation. Boards like to keep their fingers clean," I said. "So they hire others to muddy the water." His expression was grim. If you're implying one of them engineered this, I'm implying nothing yet, I cut in. But I'd like to meet Ramesh, and then I'll need names of the most restless board members. A man who sees profit in your downfall is a man with motive enough to tamper with porcelain. He pressed a button on his desk phone. A few moments later, Ramesh entered, compact, neat, with the kind of precision in his movements that comes from years of service and the awareness that one mistake can end them. Ramesh, Roke said. This is Mr. Goodwin working with Nero Wolfe. He'll ask you about last Tuesday. Ramesh inclined his head. Of course, sir. I got up and circled him like he was a new model car. You handled the Meissen cup that morning? Yes, sir. I polish it weekly. It was on the shelf until Mr. Chase requested it. I rinsed it carefully with gloves. Then I brought it to Mr. Roke. Anyone else touch it before the tasting? He thought. Miss Roke took it from me to place on the tray. Mr. Chase insisted on handling it himself. He turned it in his hands. He made a remark about the delicate bones of Europe cradling the vigor of the Americas. That's a mouthful, I said. And after the tasting, I cleared the service. I washed the cup myself. That was when I noticed a faint sheen. I thought it was residue from the coffee oils. I washed again. But the ring remained. And you didn't mention this? His throat tightened. Sir, I did not want to suggest to Mr. Roke that his guest had played a trick. It seemed incredible. Nothing's incredible where egos and money meet, I told him. Where do you keep this ester blend camellia mentioned? The training compound? In the cellar tasting room, locked. Only the tasters and I have keys. Mr. Chase might know of it. He has attended our calibrations before. I scribbled mental notes. All right, Ramesh. That will do. Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut. He bowed slightly and withdrew. I turned back to Roke. He's loyal, but loyalty doesn't make a man blind. Somebody wanted that cup doctored. If Chase did it himself, then his article was theatre. If not, someone wanted him to write it. Roke's jaw tightened. That distinction matters? It matters to Wolfe. He likes knowing whether he's dealing with a showman or a saboteur. Roke gave me 3 board names, each sounding like it had been carved into a family vault. Henry Ralston, Miriam Keever, and Lionel Day. Ralston was the numbers man, Keever the marketing strategist, and Day a rival importer who had been folded into the Roke empire years back without quite forgiving it. I thanked him, pocketed the names, and took a stroll through the main floor. The Roke rooms at midday were busy, patrons sampling espresso flights with solemn expressions, servers gliding like they had ballet training, and a faint hum of conversation that made it feel like a temple of caffeine. I leaned against the brass rail and let the crowd speak. 2 young baristas were whispering behind the counter. Said Mr. Chase was smiling before he even tasted it. Maybe he wanted the scandal. His columns always go viral when he tears someone down. Still tampering with the cup. That's extreme. I slid over casually. Excuse me. I couldn't help overhearing. You both were here Tuesday. They froze. One, freckled and nervous, nodded. I was on shift. I saw Mr. Chase come in. He shook hands with Miss Roke. He carried his own pen and notebook. He looked confident. Confident enough to fake outrage? I asked. The other taller one with slick hair frowned. He loves the drama. He always makes it about him. But this time it felt staged, like he'd already written the piece. That fit Wolfe's theory. The performance came first. The tasting second. I thanked them with a grin that bought silence and left before curiosity could expand. Back on 47th, I ducked into a diner and phoned Wolfe. He picked up on the second ring, which for him is like sprinting. Yes? Roke is steady. Ramesh is loyal but noticed the residue. Chase handled the cup himself and probably rehearsed his indignation. The ester blend is kept locked, but Chaussee has seen it before. The board includes 3 worth watching: Ralston, Keever, and Day. Wolfe made a noise halfway between a grunt and a dissertation. Chase will posture. He is irrelevant until I decide to puncture him. Focus on Day. A man absorbed into another's empire and kept there will dream of dissolving it. Keever, too, her métier is appearances. She may regard Oliver Roke's palette as a liability to the brand. Ralston is a banker of the soul. They are all capable. And you, meanwhile? I am conducting experiments, he said. The residue's behavior under heat and dilution. The manner of its application? It will tell me whether this was done with ignorance or art. Fine, I said. I'll work the board. But one thing, Wolfe, Chase isn't just grandstanding. He may be someone's instrument, and instruments don't always know they're being played. That, Wolfe said, is precisely why I require you in the field. Instruments sound different depending on the hand that strikes them. I hung up and finished my coffee, which tasted like punishment after the morning's. Context. By late afternoon, I had tracked Lionel Day to his office 2 floors above the Roke Rooms. His secretary was a man who looked as if he'd been trained to keep secrets by the Vatican. After 10 minutes of polite fencing, I was waved in. Day was in his 50s, smooth, with a tan that belonged to yachts and a smile that belonged to salesmanship. His office smelled faintly of cedar and ambition. "Mr. Goodwin," he said warmly, "I wondered when Nero Wolfe would send an emissary. Please sit. What can I do for you?" "You can tell me," I said, "whether you think Oliver Roke's judgment is failing." His smile widened a notch. "That is a rather direct opening. It saves time. And I'm on the clock." He steepled his fingers. "Oliver has built an empire, but empires must modernize. The younger palates demand novelty. He clings to tradition. That is not failure, but it is a form of blindness. Blind enough to let a columnist humiliate him? Mr. Chase is a provocateur. We all know this. But perhaps the humiliation was overdue. It reminds us that no reputation is untouchable." "Sounds like you enjoyed the show," I said. "Enjoyed? No. Observed? Yes, it was inevitable. If not Chase, someone else would have raised the question. The board must consider the future." I watched his face, smooth, too smooth. He wasn't confessing, but he wasn't exactly grieving either. When I left, the evening had set in, and the Roke Rooms glowed like a shrine against the dusk. Somewhere behind me, Lionel Day's smile still lingered, as polished and dangerous as the brass on the railings. I knew Wolfe would be waiting in the brownstone with results from his experiments. But my gut told me that before this was done, someone was going to spill more than coffee. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe had barricaded himself in the office with the cup and the kind of silence that makes the furniture self-conscious. I handed my hat to the rack and drifted in like a man bringing weather. He didn't look up. The spoon was resting in the saucer, a pitcher of water sat on the desk, and the faintest fragrance, something sharp, chemical, and almost floral, hung in the air. "You've been busy," I said. "Dropping into my chair." "I have been patient," Wolfe corrected. "There is a difference. Patience is methodical. Busyness is frantic." He gestured at the cup as if it were an exhibit. "The residue is consistent with deliberate application. Not incidental, not accidental. Whoever placed it there measured their touch. So we're looking for someone with knowledge and nerve," I said. "That narrows it to about 36 suspects in this city alone." His lips compressed. "This compound does not appear in common kitchens. It is used in training and nowhere else. That means either a taster with access or someone who has watched them closely. Chase is both possibilities, but he is too obvious." "Too obvious doesn't mean innocent," I pointed out. Day, on the other hand, talked like a man rehearsing an obituary. "Keefer and Ralston are still on my dance card." Wolfe leaned back, shut his eyes, and spread his fingers across his middle. "You will see them both. But first you will watch Chase. Not speak, watch. I want to know whether he wears guilt like a hat or hides it in his pocket." That suited me fine. I enjoy watching men who think their charm is camouflage. The next morning I planted myself at a cafe Chase was known to haunt. One of those places where the coffee comes with a lecture about sustainability, and the chairs look salvaged from a philosophy seminar. Sure enough, at 10 sharp, in swept Dorian Chase with his tailored coat, his notebook already open, and a face that begged to be disagreed with. He ordered loudly, "A single-origin Ethiopian brewed through a filter that looked like lab glass," and took a corner table where he could be seen. He sipped, scribbled, glanced around for witnesses. It was performance from the start. I nursed a black coffee 2 tables over and watched. A young woman, student type, eager, approached him for advice. He gave it with the grace of a pope, granting indulgences, all the while flipping his pen like a conductor's baton. When she left, he scribbled more, then tilted his cup, frowning theatrically. He flagged down the barista, lectured on extraction time, and made sure half the cafe heard him. The man was addicted to spotlight. But was he also addicted to sabotage? That was the question. After an hour of this parade, he rose, adjusted his scarf with unnecessary flair, and left. I tailed him across 2 blocks to a narrow office building with his name stenciled on the frosted glass. Chase Editorial Services. Inside, through the window, I saw shelves stacked with bags of beans, small vials, and notebooks. He had the toolkit of a taster. And in a corner cabinet, I caught the glint of something glass-stoppered. Training vials. My pulse ticked up a notch. I made a note and moved on. No point confronting him then. Wolfe would want a proper snare, not my improvisation. That afternoon, I paid a call on Miriam Keever at her marketing firm. She was mid-40s, brisk, and ran her office like a drill sergeant with a fondness for slogans. She welcomed me with a handshake that could crack walnuts. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I assume this is about Oliver's little crisis?" "That's the polite term," I said. "Some call it sabotage." Her eyes sharpened. "I call it inevitable. The Roque brand is stuck in the 19th century. Consumers today want stories, not just beans. They want lifestyle. Oliver insists the coffee sells itself. It doesn't. Lifestyle doesn't usually involve spiking cups," I said. "True, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone decided to accelerate what's already happening. Oliver is vulnerable. One bad review and the board panics." She folded her arms. "I wouldn't bother dirtying my hands. I prefer clean executions. Campaigns, not conspiracies. Not conspiracies." I believed her halfway. She had motive, sure, but she was too direct, too public. A woman who plots ad campaigns doesn't usually dab oil into porcelain. I left with the sense that Keever was a spectator, not the saboteur. Next on the list was Ralston, the numbers man. He kept an office downtown that smelled like money had just been ironed. Pale, thin, glasses perched low. He looked like the kind of man who measured his pulse quarterly. "Mr. Goodwin," he greeted me, adjusting his spectacles. "If this is about Oliver, I can assure you the board is acting with restraint. For now, I repeated. And if restraint fails, then we act. The company must survive beyond one man's palate. Investors want certainty, not sentiment. You'd prefer him retired. I'd prefer stability." He steepled his fingers. "But sabotage? That is not my style. Too crude. If Oliver stumbles, we need not trip him. Gravity will do it." He was cold enough to be convincing. Yet cold men sometimes pay warm hands to do their work. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the rundown. Chase with his vials, Keever with her slogans, Ralston with his ledgers. Wolfe listened without opening his eyes, which meant he was listening hard. "Chase has access and inclination," he murmured. "Keever has ambition, but not the temperament. Ralston has motive, but prefers arithmetic. Tay remains the most likely. Injured pride is the sharpest spur, but Chase is dangerous because he believes himself above reproach. Vanity is an instrument others may play." He opened his eyes and fixed me. "We must unsettle him. How?" I asked. "By forcing him into inconsistency. Tomorrow evening you will invite him here, under the pretense of consultation. I will bait him. If he tampered, he will betray it. If he did not, he will reveal whose hand guided his," I whistled. "You expect him to confess over brandy?" "I expect him to expose himself over arrogance," Wolfe said. "It is more reliable than alcohol." The next evening Chase arrived, silk scarf knotted, smile polished. He looked around the office with an air that suggested he'd already written the review. Wolfe, immovable behind his desk, inclined his head just enough to qualify as greeting. "Mr. Chase," he said, "your palate has been much discussed. I am curious. Would you indulge me in a demonstration?" Chase's eyes lit. "Gladly. My reputation precedes me." Wolfe gestured at Fritz, who entered with 2 cups, one plain porcelain, one Meissen replica Wolfe had borrowed from his collection. Each held a blind pour. "Tell me," Wolfe said, "which is compromised?" Chase tasted theatrically, swirling, inhaling, eyes half closed. Then he pronounced, "This one." He tapped the replica. Wolfe's lip curled. "That cup is clean." For the first time, Chase faltered. His eyes flicked to me, then back. "Impossible." "You tasted what you expected," Wolfe interrupted. "You tasted performance. You are a man who cannot separate sensation from stagecraft. That makes you useful to someone who required a willing fool." Chase bristled. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm stating," Wolfe said evenly, "that you were manipulated. The residue in Mr. Roque's cup was real, but you did not place it. You merely sang the song someone handed you. The question is, whose tune was it? Chase flushed. If you mean Lionel Day— He stopped too late. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Indeed, you are not guilty, Mr. Chase. You are merely vain. Day, however, is another matter. Chase rose indignant, but I could see the crack. He'd given Wolfe what he wanted, a name without coercion. When he stormed out, Wolfe leaned back, satisfied. There, Archie. The man has confirmed it without knowing. Day tampered. Chase performed. The board wavered. It is now a matter of assembly, I nodded. Which means soon you'll have your favorite sport. Suspects in a row, you behind the desk, me keeping the peace. He closed his eyes, content. Precisely. The cup has told its story. The rest is merely punctuation. The case was closing in. But I knew enough about Wolfe to know he'd never call it finished until every man and woman had been paraded before him, stripped not of clothing, but of excuses. And judging by the look on his face, Lionel Day's excuses were about to have a very short lifespan. Wolfe had leaned back in his chair, fingertips tented, lids lowered, as if the conversation with Chase had been no more taxing than trimming an orchid root, but I could see in the set of his mouth that he was already moving on from Chase's vanity slip to the bigger question. How to haul Lionel Day out of his upholstered lair and pin him like a butterfly without letting him wriggle. You want him here? I asked. Not yet, Wolfe said. I want him restless. A man secure in his schemes will sit tight. A man uncertain will expose himself. You, Archie, will provide the uncertainty. That was my cue to start stirring the pot. The next morning I put on my best grin and paid another visit to the roke rooms. The place hummed, with the kind of tension that comes when an empire pretends nothing is wrong while everyone whispers it is. The baristas served with stiff backs, the patrons talked softer than usual, and the shine on the brass looked a shade less confident. I angled toward the stairwell and went up to Day's office. His secretary recognized me this time and pursed his lips like I was a tax collector. Mr. Day is busy. He'll want this kind of busy, I said, flashing a smile I didn't mean. Tell him I've just come from Nero Wolfe, and he's about to be in the evening papers if he doesn't start singing in the right key. That did it. I was waved through like contraband. Day was behind his desk, jacket off, tie loose, but still radiating the polish of a man who kept spare charm in a drawer. Goodwin, he said, tone almost genial. Have you come to accuse me again? I enjoyed your first attempt. Not accuse, I said, planting myself in the chair across from him. Warn. Wolfe has already proved the cup was doctored. He's got witnesses lined up, and he's preparing one of his patented office gatherings. You know how those end. Someone leaves with handcuffs. Someone else leaves with egg on his face. Guess which part you'd play? Day's smile was steady, but a flicker crossed his eyes. Really? And what makes you so sure I'd be his chosen villain? Because Chase already named you, I said flatly. Not on purpose, but names slip easier than oil. He danced right into it, and Wolfe isn't a man to miss a cue. That got through. Day's hand tightened around his pen, and for a second his genial mask cracked, just enough for me to glimpse the steel underneath. Then it was back, smooth and practiced. Chase is a fool, he said. He would blame anyone to shield his own incompetence. Maybe, I said. But Wolfe doesn't make mistakes. If he says the boardroom is about to get very hot, you can either step forward now or be dragged later. Your call. I let that hang, then stood, tipped my hat, and strolled out before he could recover. The point wasn't to force a confession. The point was to leave him rattling like a coin in a tin cup. That evening, when I reported back, Wolfe listened without interruption, then allowed himself the faintest smile. Excellent. He will stew, and a stewing man is a careless man. Now, Archie, I want eyes on him. Bring Saul. That was my cue to ring Saul Panzer, the best shadow in the business. He arrived at the brownstone promptly at 8. Neat as always, his expression a calm slate. Wolfe gave him the target, the instructions, and a warning. Mr. Day will attempt discretion. He will fail. Follow him. Note whom he meets and report without flourish. Saul nodded once, no promises, no drama, and left. 2 days later, Saul came back with news worth hearing. Day had been keeping late evenings, slipping out of his office and heading not home, but to a discreet townhouse on the Upper East Side. The occupant? None other than Miriam Keever. Alone? I asked. Saul shook his head. They weren't lovers, if that's your angle. They were plotting. Doors shut, voices low. I managed a glimpse at her desk through the blinds. Graphs, sales projections, a draft press release with new direction for Roke Coffee in the header. No signatures, but no doubt. That was enough to make Wolfe's eyebrows twitch upward, which in his vocabulary was the equivalent of shouting Eureka. "So," he said, "our strategist and our malcontent. A conspiracy of marketing and grievance. That aligns neatly." "Neatly," I said, "but not airtight. Kiva wants modern branding, Day wants Oliver out. They both get something if Roke looks senile. But we still don't know who did the dirty work with the cup." "Dirty work with the cup." "True," Wolfe admitted. "But we have the circle of hands. Ramesh, Camellia, Oliver, Chase, and perhaps one instructed by Day or Kiva. We require proof that one of them carried out the act at Day's instigation. That proof, Archie, you will obtain, by charm, guile, or brute nosiness. By whatever means you possess," Wolfe said, eyes closing again. "Begin with Ramesh. He is too careful to miss an instruction. Men in service notice details their masters dismiss. So back I went to the Roke rooms, where Ramesh received me in the cellar tasting room, surrounded by the scent of beans and the faint clink of glass vials. He was wary but polite as always. "Ramesh," I said, "let's skip the dance. You saw the ring before anyone else. You know it wasn't natural. The question is, did anyone nudge you, suggest you handle the cup differently? Encourage you to overlook something?" He hesitated. His hands, always so precise, fidgeted at his cuffs. "I was told casually by Mr. Day that Mr. Chase enjoys a sense of ceremony, that he prefers to handle the cup himself. He said it in passing, as if advising me to indulge a guest. I thought nothing of it. That was before or after you set the cup out?" "Before," he admitted. His voice dropped. Hand later, Miss Kiva came to the cellar on another pretext, checking labels. She asked about the ester blend. She said she was curious about how tasters train. I showed her briefly. She seemed very interested. That was the crack we needed. I thanked him and left, mind ticking. Wolfe wouldn't just like this, he'd feast on it. Back at the brownstone, I laid it all out. Wolfe listened, eyes closed, then opened them with a gleam that told me he'd already written the ending in his head. Kiva with knowledge, Day with motive, Chase with vanity. Ramesh unwittingly steered. And Oliver, the victim. "It is time, Archie. Summon them." "You mean—" "Yes," Wolfe said, sitting taller, his voice gaining weight. "The office gathering. Tomorrow evening. Invite all parties. Oliver, Roke, Camellia, Ramesh, Chase, Day, and Kiva. They will come, for they are anxious, and anxiety is a leash. I will conduct the rest." That was the moment when the brownstone shifted atmosphere. Fritz, upon hearing of the gathering, sighed with the patience of a man who knew extra chairs would scar the carpet. I called each name in turn, delivering Wolfe's summons with the confidence of a man who knew none of them could refuse. Even Chase, puffed up with indignation, agreed, perhaps expecting another chance at theatre. The stage was set. The suspects would come. Wolfe would sit, immovable, a mountain with words for weapons. And I, as usual, would watch the sparks fly, ready to catch the fragments. But even as I laid the phone down after the last call, I couldn't shake the thought. This wasn't just about coffee, cups, or corporate branding. Wolfe was right from the start. This was about humiliation, the weaponization of doubt, the deliberate stripping of a man's confidence. A kind of murder without blood, and Wolfe, more than anyone I'd ever met, hated that species of crime with a particular, heavy loathing. The next evening promised to be a reckoning. By the time the evening rolled around, the brownstone had the air of a stage before the curtain. Fritz had polished the brass on the doors, moved the chairs into their stiff semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, and retreated with the dignity of a man unwilling to watch amateurs tread on his carpet. Wolfe was in his chair, immovable, broad, hands folded over the equator of his middle as if he were about to conduct judgment with a single gesture. I had set the chairs myself, one for each invitee, angled so their eyes would all be forced back to Wolfe, whether they liked it or not. The first to arrive was Camellia Roke, on time to the minute, wearing a dress that was neither flashy nor meek. She carried herself like she knew she had a stake in the night, but wasn't yet sure if it was salvation or exposure. Behind her came Oliver Roke, shoulders taut, jaw tight. The air of a man who had been forced into someone else's play, but intended to own the stage once there. Ramesh followed soon after, precise as always, his eyes wide at the idea of sitting in Wolfe's office, as though he had stepped onto hallowed ground. Then came Chase, scarf perfectly knotted, notebook in hand, his expression a careful blend of indignation and delight. The man loved nothing more than drama, And Wolfe had baited the trap with just the right scent. Kiva arrived next, brisk and polished, radiating the kind of confidence that came from rehearsed control. She took her seat with a snap of her bag and crossed her legs like she was entering a boardroom rather than an ambush. Last came Lionel Day, cool as ice, smile sharp, eyes giving nothing. He greeted Wolfe politely, greeted the room smoothly, and sat with the air of a man who believed he could withstand anything. Once they were all seated, Wolfe let the silence thicken. He was a master of timing, and he knew that a silence in his office was a heavier weapon than any speech. I watched their faces, Camellia shifting slightly, Oliver stiff as granite, Ramesh nervous, Chase impatient, Kiva unreadable, Day perfectly composed. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes, a movement that carried more weight than most men's speeches. His voice was calm, precise. You are here because a cup was used to discredit a man. A cup, a compound, and a performance. Oliver Roke's reputation was tampered with deliberately to convince the world that his judgment had failed. That is the crime. The question before us is, whose hand moved? He let that hang, then turned his gaze to Chase. Mr. Chase, you tasted the roast. You declared it flawed. You wrote that Mr. Roke was senescent. Did you believe what you wrote? Chase straightened, seizing his cue. I reported what I tasted. It is my duty to my readers to be honest. I found the roast perfumed, overripe. I said so. You found what you were meant to find, Wolfe said coldly. You tasted not the coffee, but the residue placed in that cup. You did not recognize it, but you performed your outrage faithfully, as you always do. Chase flushed. If you are implying, I'm stating, Wolfe cut in, that you were a pawn. Not the culprit. Sit. Chase bristled, but he sat. Wolfe's eyes shifted to Ramesh. You, sir. You handled the cup. Did you adulterate it? Ramesh's hands twisted. No, sir. I polished it as always, rinsed it carefully, placed it on the tray. But, he faltered, glancing at Day. But you were instructed, Wolfe finished. Mr. Day suggested to you in advance that Mr. Chase preferred ceremony, that you should allow him to handle the cup. Ramesh swallowed hard. Yes, sir. He said it casually. I thought it harmless. Wolfe nodded once, then shifted his gaze to Kiva. And you, madam. You visited the cellar. You inquired about the ester blend. You studied it. Do you deny this? Kiva's lips curved faintly. I ask questions, yes. I am curious by nature. But to imply I— Do not insult me, Wolfe said. His tone sharpened enough to slice through the room. You had motive to modernize the brand by discrediting the patriarch. You had the imagination to use a ritual as a weapon. But you lacked one thing, the nerve to act alone. His eyes snapped to Day. That you provided. Mr. Day, you have lived under the Roke name, profiting yet resenting, folded into an empire that never let you be emperor. You wanted Oliver diminished. You wanted him pushed out, forced aside, and you saw an opportunity. Day's smile remained, but I caught the flicker in his eyes, the faint tightening of his jaw. You spin a tidy tale, he said. But tales are not evidence. On the contrary, Wolfe said, evidence is abundant. The residue in the cup, faint but deliberate. The testimony of Ramesh, who confirms your subtle instruction. The observations of Mr. Goodwin, who saw you with Miss Kiva, drafting a new direction before the old one had fallen. And finally the performance of Mr. Chase, who gave your scheme its flourish. You planted doubt in Oliver Roke's tongue and had it broadcast to the world. That is your handiwork. The room went taut. Oliver's eyes blazed. Camelia's hand clenched the arm of her chair. Kiva's mask of confidence cracked just slightly, enough to show tension beneath. Chase fumbled with his scarf. Day, though, leaned back, smile still in place. All circumstantial. You cannot prove I touched the cup. Wolfe's voice dropped heavier. You misunderstand. I do not need to prove you touched it. I need only show you arranged for it to be touched. Miss Kiva supplied the compound. You supplied the suggestion. Ramesh, unwitting, obeyed. Mr. Chase performed. The chain is complete. No one else had both motive and means. Motive and means. The silence that followed was suffocating. Day held Wolfe's gaze, but his fingers twitched on the armrest, betraying the calm he tried to maintain. Finally Oliver spoke, voice low but fierce. You did this? You tried to ruin me? Day's mask slipped. For a moment his voice was sharp, naked. You've had everything, Oliver. The name, the empire, the worship, and you refuse to move with the times. I was swallowed into your house and left to serve. You think yourself eternal. But no man is. That was enough. The words hung there undeniable. He realized too late he'd confessed, in the only way that mattered. He straightened, trying to patch the hole, but the damage was done. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. You see, ladies and gentlemen, vanity, ambition, resentment, all predictable. But the ritual betrayed him. He thought he could mock a man by making him doubt his own senses. That I will not forgive. Oliver sat rigid, breathing heavy. Camellia reached for his hand, grounding him. Ramesh looked stricken. Chase fumbled with his notebook, clearly calculating how to spin this into a column that wouldn't land him in a courtroom. Kiva's expression was icy, but she said nothing, not even in defense. Wolfe opened his eyes again. Mr. Day, your fate is not mine to decide. The law will have its portion. But know this, you sought to murder a man's confidence. That crime in this house is as vile as any other. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. That about wraps it. Unless anyone here wants to improve their evening by making a full confession to me and the police downstairs. That was my bluff, but it landed well enough. Day's face darkened. He rose, stiff and cornered, but he had nothing left to say. Kiva, seeing her partner exposed, stood as well, lips pressed thin. Chase muttered something about being misled. Ramesh looked at the floor. The gathering ended the way they usually do, with Wolfe motionless, victorious, and the rest of us buzzing in the aftermath. As the guests filed out, silence reclaiming the office, Wolfe reached for his beer, lifted it with care, and took a long swallow. Fritz, he called. Dinner. That was that. Justice delivered, dinner restored. For Wolfe, the two were often the same order of business. But as I watched Oliver and Camellia leave, a little less burdened, I knew this case would stick with Wolfe longer than most. Not because it was complicated, it wasn't, not by his standards, but because it had involved the calculated dismantling of a man's pride, the weaponizing of ritual and trust. And Wolfe, for all his faults, couldn't abide the desecration of dignity. I let out a breath, loosened my tie, and leaned back. Another gathering, another unmasking, another quiet night at the brownstone. Except for the lingering scent of coffee and betrayal, which takes longer than a meal to wash out. The evening dissolved the way they usually do after Wolfe has drawn his line in the sand. The suspects left in staggered silence, each carrying their own brand of defeat or reprieve. Day's jaw was set hard enough to crack his teeth. Kiva's stride was sharp, and Chase muttered to himself as though rehearsing tomorrow's column. Oliver and Camellia lingered longest, the father tight with simmering rage, the daughter composed enough to thank Wolfe before guiding him out. When the door closed behind them, the brownstone inhaled its usual peace again, and Wolfe leaned back with the air of a man reclaiming his sanctuary. Fritz appeared with dinner, squab roasted in wine and herbs, and for a while the only sound in the house was the careful clink of cutlery. Wolfe consumed with his usual precision, but there was a weight in his stillness I recognized. When dessert arrived, a chilled Bavarian cream, he spoke without looking up. Archie, I dislike incompleteness. You got your confession, I pointed out. They all but printed it on a billboard. The board will know. The law will know. Case closed. His eyes flicked to me. Case closed is not synonymous with truth complete. Day acted from resentment, yes, but he did not prepare the residue himself. Miss Kiva obtained it. Ramesh delivered the cup. And yet, the application itself, the delicate precision of that ring, required a hand accustomed to calibration. Neither Kiva nor Day possesses that skill. I frowned. You're saying we've still got a missing hand in this orchestra? Precisely. He dabbed his lips with a napkin. Day was the mind, Kiva the strategist. But someone else, someone with practical experience, applied the final touch. Without that hand, the crime was impossible. That wasn't the sort of pronouncement I liked to hear after dessert. I leaned back. So who, Ramesh? He had access. No, Wolfe said flatly. His manner is one of scrupulous service. He would not risk discovery for Day's ambition. But there is another. I thought of the tasting again, the circle of hands. Camellia? His brows knit, not in disapproval, but in consideration. She handled the cup, yes. She claims vigilance, but vigilance does not preclude desperation. If she feared her father's decline, she might... He stopped, shaking his head. But her motive would have been to protect, not destroy. No, someone else still. That night I didn't sleep easy. Wolfe rarely left a puzzle half-finished, and if he said the chain wasn't complete, then somewhere a link was missing. The next morning I returned to the Roke rooms. The place was quieter than usual. Word of the confrontation had clearly leaked. Oliver Roke's name was no longer spoken with reverence, but with a careful neutrality, as though the staff weren't sure which way the wind was blowing. I found Camelia in her office, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Her desk neat but untouched. "Miss Roke," I said, leaning against the doorframe, "you left last night lighter. But I've seen feathers carry more weight than you're showing now." She gave me a weary smile. "My father refuses to speak of it. He feels humiliated, even though Mr. Wolfe proved the sabotage. The board still wants blood. They'll press for retirement. And you—" "I won't allow it," she said fiercely. Then she sighed. "But I don't know how to stop them. Day and Kiva are not finished. Exposure may wound them, but ambition doesn't die so easily." Her words rang true. I probed further. "You handled the cup that day. Did you notice anything unusual before Chase touched it?" She shook her head slowly. "Nothing. It looked clean, as always." "I would have sworn—" She broke off, frowning. "Wait, there was something odd. When I placed the cup on the tray, I noticed the faintest fragrance, like jasmine. I thought it was residue from the flowers in the office. But now—" That was enough to make me straighten. Jasmine, esters often carried floral notes. If she smelled it before Chase touched the cup, then the tampering had already been done, which meant the hand had moved earlier than we thought. I thanked her, left, and went looking for Ramesh. I found him in the cellar, cataloguing sacks with the precision of a jeweler. When I pressed him, he admitted something he hadn't before. "Sir, I did notice the steward from Mr. Day's office in the corridor near the cellar that morning. I thought nothing of it. He sometimes delivers messages. But he lingered. That was a thread worth pulling. Day's steward, the man with the Vatican face. I went back uptown and found him outside Day's office, quiet as always. I gave him my best smile and said, 'You've got steady hands. Ever train as a taster?' His eyes flickered. 'I have assisted.' Assisted enough to know how to apply an ester blend to a cup without leaving a smear? He stiffened, and that was all I needed. I didn't push further. A man that controlled wouldn't crack on the street. But I had what Wolfe needed, the missing hand. When I laid it out for Wolfe that evening, he gave a single nod. 'Yes, that completes it. Day and Kiva conceived, but the steward executed.' A servant's skill turned to malice. 'It confirms the chain. So what now?' I asked. 'Now,' Wolfe said, 'we deliver the truth to the Roke board. They will not resist me. No collection of financiers dares contradict logic when it is placed before them with clarity.' He arranged the meeting for the next afternoon, not at the brownstone, but at the Roke rooms themselves. Wolfe hated leaving home, but this was a matter of theatre. He wanted the revelation on their ground, in the very halls where the sabotage had begun. We arrived to find the board assembled, faces tight, Oliver grim, Camelia resolute. Wolfe settled into the largest chair in the room like a monarch accepting tribute, and began. He spoke for 20 minutes, laying out each link in the chain, the residue, the ritual, the performance, the instructions. He named Day and Kiva as architects, the steward as instrument. He described in detail how the ester blend must have been applied, diluted, brushed gently along the porcelain, left faint enough to whisper to the tongue without screaming. By the time he finished, silence filled the boardroom. Ralston shifted uneasily. Kiva's face was pale. Day's mask had cracked entirely, and he glared at Wolfe with hatred that could have boiled coffee. Oliver, though, sat straighter than I'd seen him in days. When Wolfe concluded, he spoke in a voice that rang, "You tried to unman me. You failed. The board will hear me now." And they did. By the end of the session, Day was removed. Kiva suspended pending review, and Oliver reaffirmed as chairman. His reputation, battered but not broken, had been restored. That night, back at the brownstone, Wolfe dined in rare satisfaction. "It is done," he said, not because the guilty were exposed, though they were, but because the weapon was neutralized. No man should be made to doubt his own senses by another's malice. That is worse than theft, worse than fraud. It is a desecration of the self. He lifted his glass of beer and sipped, a benediction. I leaned back and let him have the last word. In this house, justice wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was about restoring balance. And tonight, balance had been served with squab and Bavarian cream. For 2 days after Wolfe's performance in the Roke boardroom, the brownstone basked in the kind of quiet he prefers, thick, deliberate, punctuated only by Fritz's culinary rhythms and the occasional turning of a page. Wolfe had declared the matter concluded, and as far as he was concerned, when he closed a case, the world ought to close with it. I let him enjoy the illusion. My job is to know when illusions start to fray. On the third morning, the phone rang at 10:45, a dangerous hour to disturb him. I caught it before Wolfe could register the intrusion. Camelia's voice came across tight and rushed. "Mr. Goodwin, I must see you. Something's happened." I kept my voice level. "To your father?" "No, to me. To all of us. Please, come quickly. And don't bring Mr. Wolfe yet. He won't move. You'll have to see first." She hung up before I could press her. That wasn't routine. I weighed the risk of leaving Wolfe undisturbed against the risk of ignoring the tremor in her voice. I grabbed my hat. At the Roke rooms, I found Camelia in her office, pale but composed. On her desk lay an envelope slit open with a silver knife. She gestured me toward it. I picked it up. The paper was thick, the ink sharp. The message was brief. "The board is not finished. Neither is Day. If Oliver will not retire, he will be forced. Choose wisely." No signature, but the smell of threat clung to it stronger than the scent of roasted beans drifting through the vents. Camelia watched me read. "It was delivered this morning by hand. No one saw who. Ramesh found it slipped under the door. Has your father seen it?" "No, he's upstairs meeting suppliers. I didn't want to alarm him until I had spoken to you." I folded the note. "This isn't just bruised pride anymore. Day has been exposed, but he still has claws. Either he's bluffing, or he's got another card to play. Either way, Wolfe won't like it." She gave me a grim smile. "Then you'd better tell him. But I needed you to see it first, so you'd know it isn't exaggeration." When I returned to the brownstone and laid the letter on Wolfe's desk, his eyes narrowed. He didn't touch it. He never touches evidence unless he must. He leaned back, fingertips together, face heavy with thought. "Predictable," he muttered. "Exposure breeds desperation. Mr. Day has been cut loose, but ambition does not wither in sunlight. He will attempt something reckless, like another performance." I asked. "Or worse," Wolfe said. "He has already tried to destroy a man's reputation. Now, failing subtlety, he may attempt force. Archie, you will guard Oliver Roke. That wasn't a casual assignment. You think Day would try something physical?" Wolfe's lips pressed into a line. "A man cornered by failure and stripped of power may lash out crudely. We will not underestimate him." So that's how I found myself shadowing Oliver Roke for the next 24 hours. He didn't like it. He was a man accustomed to dignity, not bodyguards. But he tolerated me because Camelia insisted, and because the letter sat like a stone in his pocket. At dinner that evening, in a private room at the Roke rooms, Oliver met with 2 potential investors. I kept to the background, watching faces. Nothing suspicious until the plates were cleared. Then one of the waiters leaned too close when setting down coffee cups. His hand lingered on the porcelain a second too long. I was on my feet before Oliver touched it. I intercepted the cup and set it aside. The waiter froze, eyes darting. He wasn't one of the regulars. His accent, when I pressed him, slipped in a way rehearsed accents don't. Before he could bolt, 2 security men came in at Camelia's signal and took him. In his pocket we found a small vial, stoppered, carrying the faint floral note I now recognized all too well. Oliver's face went white. "Again," he whispered. I phoned Wolfe immediately. He didn't raise his voice, but his words came cold and final. "Bring the man here. And Archie, be careful. If Day sent him, he may not be the only instrument." Back at the brownstone, we seated the imposter waiter opposite Wolfe. He was mid-30s, wiry, with the kind of eyes that never rest. Wolfe studied him a full minute before speaking. "Your name," the man licked his lips. "Raphael, your employer." "I don't know what you mean." "Pfui," Wolfe said. It came out like a gavel. "You were hired to place residue in a cup. You were supplied with the vial. You were instructed to act at a particular dinner, knowing Oliver Roke would be present. You are not imaginative enough to conceive this yourself. You are an instrument." "Who holds the bow?" The man's eyes flicked just once, and Wolfe caught it. "Day," he said softly, still. even now. Under Wolfe's pressure, Raphael admitted the scheme. Day had promised him money to perform the trick, framing it as a harmless prank, a way to embarrass Roque further. Raphael hadn't known the full context, only that he was to doctor the cup and slip away. When Wolfe dismissed him to Saul Panzer's custody for delivery to the police, the office grew heavy with silence. Wolfe closed his eyes and exhaled. "It is clear," he said, "that Day has not accepted defeat. He seeks to repeat his insult, to persist until Oliver Roque collapses under pressure. That cannot be permitted." "Then we shut him down," I said. "Yes, but methodically." His eyes opened. Archie summoned Camelia and Oliver. They must hear the truth of what persistence they face. "Tomorrow we will end it." The next afternoon they came. Oliver looked worn but steady, Camelia resolute. Wolfe spoke slowly, each word placed like a stone. He explained the attempt, the vial, the impostor. He described Day's desperation, his unwillingness to yield, and then he made his decree. Oliver Roque must appear in public, taste publicly, and prove publicly. Only then will this shadow pass. Day's plots depend on secrecy. We will deprive him of it. Camelia nodded sharply. "A demonstration. Yes, before the press." Oliver hesitated, pride warring with fear. But Wolfe's tone left no room. "Sir, if you do not, Day will persist. You must show the world that your tongue is yours and no trick can rob you of it." And so it was arranged. A public tasting, in the grand hall of the Roque Rooms, with journalists invited, with every eye upon the patriarch of coffee. Wolfe would orchestrate from his chair, I would handle the ground, and Oliver would stand or fall by his own pallet. That evening, after they left, I found Wolfe in his chair, more solemn than usual. "You're putting him on trial," I said. "No," Wolfe replied. "I am giving him back his weapon. A man's tongue, Archie, is his sword. Oliver must wield his again, or he will be defenseless forever. Tomorrow we end this," and with that he closed his eyes, leaving me to feel the weight of what tomorrow promised. Not just exposure, but redemption or ruin. The hall of the Roque Rooms had never looked so theatrical. By 3 in the afternoon, every chair was filled, every column leaned on, every inch of polished floor occupied by members of the press, investors, and the kind of curious onlookers who feed on scandal like pigeons on crumbs. The aroma of roasted beans floated through the air, competing with the low murmur of expectation. On the dais at the far end, a long mahogany table stood set with gleaming cups, kettles of water, and trays of beans, each arranged with military precision. Camelia moved through the crowd with poise, her voice steady as she greeted journalists and board members, but her eyes darted constantly, gauging, bracing. Oliver was already seated at the head of the table, a figure of gravity in a dark suit, his white hair catching the light. He looked less like a man humiliated than a man summoned to duel. I kept myself near the edge of the crowd, eyes working like gears. Saul Panzer was stationed discreetly at the rear, making sure no more imposter waiters slipped through. Fritz had contributed by preparing a small sealed tray of clean cups from the brownstone, transported under my watch. Wolfe had insisted on them. Insurance against another sabotage attempt, and Wolfe himself. He wasn't in the hall. He was in a private room upstairs, immovable as ever, issuing instructions through me as if the walls themselves bent to his will. He detested spectacle, but he understood its power and today required spectacle. My job was to be his voice and his eyes. His voice and his eyes. His voice. At precisely 3:15, Camelia stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Last week, my father's reputation was questioned. Today we demonstrate not only his integrity, but the integrity of Roque coffee. He will taste before you all without veil or trick, and you may judge." The murmurs rose, pens scribbled. Cameras clicked. Oliver lifted his chin, his hands steady on the table. The ritual began. I carried the first tray to him myself, 3 cups identical, prepared from the sealed set Wolfe had provided. One contained a clean pour of the Guatemala roast. Another, by Wolfe's design, carried a deliberately faulted sample prepared under controlled conditions. The third, plain water to cleanse. Oliver lifted the first cup, inhaled deeply, then sipped. His eyes narrowed, focused. He set it down, reached for the second, tasted and grimaced slightly. Then he lifted the third, rinsed, and turned to the audience. "The first," he said, his voice resonant, "is bright, balanced with notes of stone fruit and cocoa. It is our Guatemala estate, and it is true. The second," he gestured, is corrupted. Sour perfumed, false. Not our craft, not our pride. And the third is pure water. I tell you this not for theatre, but because my tongue knows the truth. There was a murmur of approval, nods from tasters in the crowd who recognized the accuracy of his call. He was right, and visibly so. Camellia signaled, and I brought a second tray, different beans, different pours. Again Oliver performed with precision. He named the qualities, identified the clean from the adulterated. Each declaration rang clear, and each time the murmurs grew louder, more approving. By the third round, even the most skeptical reporters were scribbling in admiration rather than suspicion. The investors leaned forward, their doubts beginning to crumble, and then, just as Wolfe had predicted, the disruption came. From the back of the hall, a voice cut through the applause like a blade. This is a charade, a performance more staged than Mr. Chase's columns. Heads turned. Lionel Day was striding down the aisle, flanked by two men I recognized as former associates of his firm. His face was flushed, his composure shredded. He carried a slip of paper in one hand, waving it like a weapon. Camellia stiffened. Oliver remained seated, his eyes narrowing. I moved to intercept, but Day raised his voice again. You all think this proves anything? Roque manipulates the test, selects his cups, controls the conditions. He cannot hide his decline, and I have proof. He slapped the paper onto the table before Oliver. A report commissioned by the board months ago, showing a decline in his sensory accuracy. He is senescent no matter how he pretends otherwise. Gasps rippled through the hall. Cameras clicked. For a moment, the air turned thick with doubt again. That was when Wolfe's plan revealed its final flourish. Camellia stepped forward, her voice sharp as glass. Mr. Day presents half a truth, as always. That report, she lifted it, was based on manipulated trials, poisoned by the same methods we have now exposed. Mr. Wolfe has traced every step, and if you doubt he has provided for this, she signaled me. I brought forward a final sealed tray, this one bearing cups prepared not by Roque staff but by Fritz himself, under Wolfe's exacting eye. Each cup bore a numbered tag. Camellia turned to the crowd. Let the journalist choose, randomly. My father will taste what you select. A murmur of excitement rolled through. One of the reporters, skeptical and sharp, came forward, shuffled the cups and placed 3 before Oliver. The room held its breath. Oliver lifted the first, inhaled, sipped. He closed his eyes, then spoke. Kenya AA, bright acidity, citrus clean. He reached for the second, sip. Sumatra Mandaling. Earthy, heavy body, tobacco. The third, sip. His lips curled faintly. And this, Guatemala again, but faltered. Spiked with esters. Deliberate. The reporter blinked, then checked the tags. His face flushed. He's correct. All correct, the room erupted. Applause, cheers, the scrape of pens racing to capture it. The investors exchanged glances, this time with relief instead of suspicion. Cameras flashed in rapid fire. Oliver sat tall, dignity restored before the world. Day's face went ashen. He stammered something about fabrication, but the crowd had already turned. His men melted back, unwilling to share his downfall. Security closed in. Through it all, Oliver remained composed. When the noise quieted, he looked out across the room. You tried to make me doubt myself. You failed. Coffee is not theatre. It is truth in a cup, and the truth has spoken. That finished it. Later, when the hall had emptied and the press had gone to file their glowing pieces, I escorted Oliver and Camellia back to Wolfe's private room. Wolfe sat in his chair untouched by the chaos, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. You did as required, he told Oliver. You reclaimed what was yours. Day is finished. His weapon broken. Oliver inclined his head, voice heavy. I owe you more than I can say. Pui, Wolfe replied. You owe me nothing. You owe yourself. You proved your senses remain intact. That is what matters, Camellia stepped forward. And to you, Mr. Wolfe, I owe my gratitude. You saved more than my father's name. You saved his belief in himself. Wolfe harumphed, uncomfortable with sentiment, and reached for his beer. Dinner, he muttered. As they left, I lingered. Wolfe sipped, closed his eyes, and spoke again, softer this time, as if only to himself. It is a greater crime to unman a soul than to steal a fortune. Fortune may be rebuilt. A soul once broken seldom is. I let the words hang, then tipped my hat. True enough. Though between us, I'm just glad we can have coffee again without flinching. He grunted. but I saw the faintest twitch of his lips. Balance had been restored. The brownstone was quiet again, and Fritz's voice floated in from the kitchen, announcing that dinner was served. And like that, the case was over. The brownstone had its silence back. That rich kind of silence that isn't empty but layered, like broth simmered until it carries everything it has touched. Wolfe had settled into it with the satisfaction of a man who had finished not only his duty, but also his dinner, and Fritz had retired to polish pans in the kitchen. I was in my chair, legs stretched, watching Wolfe as he watched nothing in particular. You'd think the case was buried, wrapped and planted, and in most ways it was. But I've learned that when Wolfe grows too still too quickly, it means his mind is chewing on something that hasn't digested. He opened his eyes at last. "Archie, fetch me the folder." Which folder was left to my imagination, since his desk had grown its usual thicket. I picked the one marked Roke in my hand and passed it across. He flipped it open and stared at Camelia's neat notes, the board's statements, the copy of the threat letter. He tapped the last with a thick forefinger. "This," he said, "is the stone in my shoe." The letter, "We nailed Day with more than ink." He's finished. Yes, but consider. Raphael, the imposter waiter, carried a vial. Where did he get it? From Day, I said. Directly? Wolfe's voice sharpened. No, Day has no skill with compounds. He would not keep them on hand. Someone supplied him, I frowned. Kiva again. She studied the stuff in the cellar. Possibly, Wolfe admitted, but her interest was opportunistic, not practical. She could not source it without help. The blend came from within Roke's circle. That landed like a stone. You're saying there's still a leak inside? Even after all this, I am saying, Wolfe replied, that the attempt at the tasting was not Day's final gasp, but evidence of his reach. His vanity is large, but his capacity for logistics is small. He had allies still. That night sleep refused me. The thought that the Roke room still carried a traitor gnawed worse than city traffic. When morning came, I was back at the establishment, making myself a nuisance until people began talking. That's a specialty of mine. The baristas were tight-lipped, the clerks stiff, but I caught a break in the cellar again. Ramesh, solemn as ever, pulled me aside. "Mr. Goodwin," he whispered, "something troubles me. A week before the first tasting, I inventoried the training vials. One was missing. I thought perhaps misfiled, but now, which one? The ester blend used for floral faulting. The same discovered in the cup," I whistled low. "And who had access?" "Only myself and the tasters." But his eyes flicked away. "One junior taster, a Mr. Fallon, was dismissed quietly last month. He had debts. He asked questions he should not. I took the name back to Wolfe. He listened, brows arched like awnings. Ah, that fills the gap. Day could not have acted without someone pliable. Fallon supplied the compound, perhaps even advised on its use. Day provided motive, Kiva encouragement. The cup became their stage. Then Fallon's the ghost still rattling chains, I said. Precisely. Find him. Precisely. Find him. Fallon wasn't hard to find if you knew where unpaid tabs collected. By late afternoon, I had him cornered at a bar in the East Village, hunched over a glass he couldn't afford. He was younger than I expected, mid-30s, with eyes that darted like minnows. When I slid onto the stool beside him, he stiffened. "Relax," I told him. "I'm not here to break kneecaps. I'm here because you've been playing with cups you shouldn't touch." His hand trembled around the glass. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do," I said easily. "The missing vial. The blend Day couldn't have dreamed up alone. You sold it, or gave it, because you needed money and he needed mischief. Only problem is, his mischief has turned criminal and your name is about to follow." He tried to bolt, but I blocked him with a smile and a hand on the bar. "Don't be stupid. The police will get to you sooner or later. Wolfe wants to hear from you first. You'd be smart to oblige." That did it. Fear broke him down faster than whiskey. By evening, I had him seated in Wolfe's office, sweat shining on his forehead, eyes darting at the books like they might testify against him. Wolfe regarded him as if observing an insect under glass. "Mr. Fallon, you were dismissed for incompetence, were you not?" Fallon's voice cracked. "For debts. They said I couldn't be trusted. And yet," Wolfe said, "you found employment of a sort. They approached you, offered money. You supplied him with the blend, perhaps more than once. Did you apply it yourself?" "No," Fallon whispered. "I only showed them how it could be done. On porcelain. How faint it needed to be. That was all. That was enough, Wolfe said grimly. You gave him the weapon. Fallon buried his face in his hands. I thought it was harmless. A trick just to embarrass. I didn't know it would go so far. Phooey, Wolfe snorted. Men who sell blades should not feign surprise when they find blood. We turned him over to the police, with Wolfe's detailed notes in tow. The press would love it. Another link in the chain, the circle of betrayal complete. Afterward, Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed. Now it is finished. The residue, the ritual, the performance, the attempt, the supply. Each link accounted for. There are no more ghosts. I sat back with relief. Then you can stop chewing the air like a dog with a bone. He opened one eye at me. Archie, a man's dignity is not a bone. It is marrow. Once drained, the body collapses. I was not content until I knew the marrow had been restored. That was Wolfe, making philosophy out of sabotage. Fritz announced dinner, and the world righted itself again. Later that night, as I wrote up the final report, I thought of Camellia, who had fought for her father's name with as much ferocity as Wolfe had defended it. I thought of Oliver, whose tongue had been doubted but never dulled. And I thought of Day, now facing not just ruin but the knowledge that every scheme had turned to ash. Wolfe was right. There are crimes worse than theft and wounds deeper than knives. To strip a man of his faith in his own senses is to kill him in slow motion. And in this case, Wolfe had done more than solve a mystery. He had returned a man to himself. I closed the report, set my pen down, and leaned back. The brownstone was quiet again. Fritz humming in the kitchen. Wolfe deep in his chair with a book. Outside, the city churned as always, restless, suspicious, ambitious. But inside, for now, order had been restored. And as far as Nero Wolfe was concerned, that was justice enough. The brownstone had returned to its routine, which meant orchids upstairs, Fritz in the kitchen, and Wolfe in his chair, treating the world as if it were an interloper he had already endured too long. You'd think the Roke affair had folded neatly into its file, shelved and forgotten. But I knew Wolfe well enough to recognize the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, and the way his eyes lingered on the folder, even after he closed it. He wasn't gnawing anymore, but he was savoring, the way some men keep a taste long after the cup is empty. The newspapers had gone mad for it. Roke Redemption screamed one headline, Sabotage in a Cup another. The photos showed Oliver standing tall, Camellia at his side, journalists scribbling like their lives depended on it. Day's name had been dragged across every column, his fall public and complete. Fallon's arrest added spice to the stew, and Chase had managed to spin a piece painting himself as a victim of manipulation, rather than the willing fool Wolfe had pegged him for. The public bought it, at least enough to let him keep his readership. Camellia sent over a note of thanks the next day, written in the crisp hand of someone who wanted her gratitude to be permanent. Wolfe read it once, grunted, and placed it in the file without comment. Oliver himself called, his voice heavy with both relief and stubborn pride. Wolfe endured the thanks as if it were a chore, then hung up with a curt, "Satisfactory." That was as much warmth as he allowed outside the kitchen. For my part, I was glad to see the case put to bed, but I've lived in this house long enough to know that endings aren't always ends. Sometimes they're echoes. So when the doorbell rang at 7 in the evening 2 days later, I braced myself. It was Camellia again, coat draped, eyes sharper than before. She stepped inside without preamble, her voice low. "I won't stay long. But there's something you should know." I hung her coat and led her into the office, where Wolfe was already scowling at the interruption. She bowed her head slightly, but her words came fast. "Father is well. His confidence has returned." "But the board—" She hesitated, then met Wolfe's gaze directly. "They're frightened. They'll keep him as chairman for now, but their faith is shaken. If another scandal rises, they'll force him out, no matter the truth. Wolfe grunted. "Phooey, they are merchants. They follow wind, not principle." "Exactly," she said, "and wind changes quickly. I wanted you to hear it first. If anyone else moves against us, it won't be through tricks with cups. It will be subtler. Contracts, investments, the sort of sabotage that looks respectable." Wolfe regarded her a long moment, then inclined his head. "You are perceptive, Miss Roke. Your father's enemies are not finished, but the next battle will not be mine. It will be his and yours." She nodded, accepting the dismissal, but her eyes lingered on him as though hoping for more. Wolfe being Wolfe gave her none. I saw her out and watched her step into the rain, her silhouette straight against the storm. When I returned, Wolfe was already reaching for a beer. "Archie, note this," he said, as if dictating to posterity. "The gravest threat to a man is not the blow of an enemy, but the doubt of his allies. Oliver Roke has survived the former. Whether he survives the latter remains to be seen." That sounded like philosophy to me, but I wrote it down anyway. The days that followed slid back into our rhythm. I kept appointments, filed reports, dodged creditors, and ferried Wolfe's words when he chose to scatter them. Wolfe attended his orchids, ate his meals, read his books. On the surface, the brownstone was as it always was, orderly, contained, impenetrable. But underneath, the echo of the case lingered. One evening, over lamb chops, Wolfe broke the silence with a remark that came out of nowhere. "The ritual of coffee is not unlike the ritual of justice. Both can be tainted by the smallest intrusion." I set down my fork. "That's what's sticking with you, isn't it? Not Day, not Fallon, not even Kiva. The idea that a cup, an innocent, ordinary thing, was turned into a weapon." His eyes glinted. "Precisely. Men will always conspire. They will always covet. But to corrupt a ritual, to twist a symbol of trust into an instrument of humiliation, that is contemptible. That is why I took the case." I leaned back, grinning. "And here I thought you took it, because a pretty woman showed up with porcelain and perfume." He closed his eyes. "For I'm not a fool. Beauty fades, perfume dissipates, but dignity once stolen may never return. That was the true client here. Not Oliver Roke, not Camellia, but dignity itself. That was Wolfe, wrapping the whole sordid mess in a ribbon of philosophy and handing it back like a gift. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't exactly easy company either. Still, I let him have it. He'd earned it." As the night settled, I looked around the office. The globe, the shelves, the desk where truth had been unwrapped, one word at a time. The brownstone was back in balance, but the city outside never stayed quiet for long. Someone somewhere was already plotting their next scheme, their next sabotage, their next desecration of trust. And when they did, the bell would ring and Wolfe would grumble, and I'd be there to open the door, because that's the rhythm of this house. Order, disruption, revelation, order again. Justice, not because Wolfe chases it, but because it insists on being brought here, to this chair, this desk, this man who won't move and won't be wrong. I leaned back, watching Wolfe sip his beer with the serenity of a man who had just refuted the world and found it satisfactory. "Well," I said, "at least this time nobody ended up dead." His eyes opened, heavy and sharp. "Archie, a man nearly did." To strip him of his faith was to kill him in essence. "Do not diminish that." "Fair enough," I admitted. "But between us, I'll still take doctored cups over corpses." His lips curved faintly, almost but not quite a smile. "As will I. Now let us have silence. Fritz will bring pears poached in red wine, and I prefer not to share them with your chatter." I let him have the silence, though in my head I was already writing the report, already shaping the words. Cases like this didn't just close, they echoed. And as long as I had a typewriter, and Wolfe had his chair, those echoes would keep finding their way into words. The city outside went on, humming, restless, suspicious, full of ambition and folly. Inside, the brownstone held steady, as it always did, until the next knock on the door. And that was the true ending. Not Day's downfall, not Oliver's redemption, not Camelia's gratitude. The true ending was the restoration of order, sealed with dinner and silence, waiting patiently for the next disturbance. Word count, 1200. The last embers of the Roke affair died down in the city as the week turned. The headlines gave way to newer scandals, and coffee lovers went back to arguing over pour-overs and press pots as though nothing more consequential had ever touched a cup. That's how New York works. Even when dignity is stolen and restored, the world insists on forgetting quickly. But the brownstone doesn't forget. It absorbs each case, adds it to its silent history, and then folds it away like a pressed leaf between books. Wolfe spent the following days in a mood of peculiar calm, even by his standards. He took his meals with the full attention of a man who considered eating as important as thinking, and he returned to his orchids with renewed devotion, as though the world's foolishness had reminded him that plants, at least, never lie. I saw him stand before a row of Miltonias one morning, gazing at them with the expression of a general reviewing troops who hadn't failed him. For my part, I caught up on paperwork, fielded calls from journalists still trying to squeeze another drop of juice from the story, and politely told them to shove off. Camellia called once more, her voice steadier this time. "My father has resumed his mornings in the tasting room," she said. "He smiles again, Archie. That is because of you and Mr. Wolfe." I told her the truth. The smile was her father's doing, the restoration Wolfe's, and my contribution was mostly carrying trays and watching egos crack. She laughed, thanked me again, and hung up. It might have ended there, clean as a finished ledger, but Wolfe never allows a case to slip away without one last summation. That evening, over squab with a Madeira reduction, he leaned back and delivered it like a lecture to the air. "Archie, observe, Mr. Day sought to wound by proxy, Miss Kiva sought to rebrand by deception, and Mr. Fallon sold his skill to mask his debts. Each acted not out of necessity but vanity. Vanity is the most corrosive of motives, for it demands not merely gain but the humiliation of others. Oliver Roke was not targeted for profit alone. He was targeted to be unmade before his peers. That is why I intervened. Theft is commonplace, murder regrettable, but the calculated unmaking of a man's confidence, that is vile." I raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying you took the case not for the fee, not for the Meissen Cup, not even for the pleasure of putting Chase in his place, but for ethics?" "Pfui," he said, though softly. "I took it because truth matters. Hand dignity once stolen must be reclaimed. That was Wolfe's verdict, as final as any gavel." He finished his squab in silence. Fritz brought pears poached in wine, and the case was laid to rest not with applause but with appetite, which in this house is the truest conclusion. As I cleared the plates, I thought back to the circle of suspects in the office, the nervous shifting, the crack in Day's composure, the moment Oliver tasted before the world and proved himself whole again. It was more than just a case. It was theatre, philosophy, and justice, all staged from a chair in a Manhattan brownstone. When the evening wound down and Wolfe closed his eyes in that peculiar way of his, half rest, half contemplation, I leaned back in my own chair and let the quiet settle. Outside, the city still churned, full of ambition, deception, and the next scheme waiting to knock on our door. Inside, balance had been restored. That's the rhythm, always. Disturbance, deduction, revelation, restoration. Wolfe never moves, but the world moves to him, and I, lucky or not, get to watch it unfold, one cup, one case, one truth at a time. And with that, the case of the cup was done.